Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome. And please excuse any technology. Greg just, 30 seconds before we started, switched me on multiple screens here, so I'm going to try this out. But welcome, everybody. Welcome to NERI Press, and my name is Joan Tabachnik. And today we're going to be hearing and talking with David Prescott, who's talking about building motivation for change, which to me is one of those, I think, really sort of exciting topics that we have a chance to really talk about. And David promised that we'll have lots of time for your questions and answers. But before I turn this over to David, I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about NERI Press. First, to say that we started out as in addition to the school that we have here, we also have a small press, and we publish mostly books initially. And over the years, we sort of realized that people are starting to move out of the book market and starting to look at other ways of digesting and taking in information. So that's why we started these webinar series. We have a monthly newsletter that's free. We have also some online courses. And we're trying to find out ways that we can help disseminate information that we know is out there that not everybody has access to. So we're really exciting to see people as far away as Wales and South Africa, or South Africa, Maine, as well as 17 people in Sacramento. So thank you and welcome, everybody. I also want to say that NERI Press is a little bit unique compared to any other publishing field, because most of us who are working here actually have an expertise in the field rather than publishing. So we really welcome your feedback. The only way we're going to be able to supply you with the best information is by hearing from you. So please, when you finish today, make sure you close out your system so that we can actually take a poll, a reader's poll. And also just wanted to also let people know that we also have sponsors. One of the reasons we can do these webinars for free is that we have a number of organizations who are sponsors. And we also have individual sponsors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end as well. So just moving on to the next slide. Hopefully I can do that with one of my... So Greg, I think I need a little help here on how to change to the next slide. Well, I can do it this way. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so basically like any other workshop, we have learning objectives, and there are also CE credits that are available if you want to, and you can go on our website, and through Orlando Behavioral, you can sign up for these CE credits. But with any other workshop, we have learning objectives. So first is to learn to distinguish between what's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We also hope that you'll learn sort of the key findings about therapeutic alliance and the factors that are common to all successful forms of treatment. And third, we want to learn about some specific exercises for professional self-development. So those are our learning objectives for today. Second, I want to just say that the PowerPoint is posted on the NERI Press website, and in about a week, we'll also be posting a recording of this. So if there's something that you missed or you have to leave early, or if you join us late, you can also hear the whole webinar on recording. And again, just when the workshop is over, please be sure to close out your account, because we'll be sending you an evaluation, and that's a great way for us to learn more about what you want. And finally, we will follow you up with a link back to here in a week, and you can sign up for CE credits anytime after that. So in that sense, we really hope to keep you involved in the NERI Press as much as possible. I think there's next slide. I'm not sure there's a better way of doing this. Really? Okay, great. Thanks. So finally, I wanted to say that if you are not aware of this really wonderful book by David Prescott and Robin Wilson called Awakening Motivation for Difficult Changes, what's really unique about this particular workbook is it explores the techniques of treatment without providing a framework for engaging your clients in the face of the fact that most clients feel ambivalent about treatment. This sort of makes sense. So David and his colleague, Robin Wilson, deal directly with the idea of motivation, setting the stage for preparatory stages of change. And once a client moves into treatment, the work will provide some concrete steps that you can use for a client to examine and address their barriers to effective treatment and ultimately for positive change. And last, I want to introduce David Prescott, which probably for many of you doesn't need any introduction, but he's the Director of Professional Development for Beckett Family of Services, and he's the past president of ATSA, He's the author and editor of 14 books, numerous articles, and so many chapters we can't count them at this point. He's lectured on this topic around the world, and his work has been translated to French, Polish, Japanese, and Korean. And David is also co-editor with Steve Benjes and myself of the monthly Neary Press newsletter. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to you, David, and welcome. Thank you for doing this with us today.
All right. Thank you, Joan. It's great to be here. And thanks for the kind introduction. Also, thanks to Steve Benjes, who can't be here today, and I hope I get her name right, Naznimi Farhudi. Did I almost get that right, Joan?
Yes.
And who was also unable to attend, but does some great stuff for Neary Press. So I'm going to click show my screen. No webinar ever goes without some kind of technical problem somewhere. So with any luck, we've already been through them with getting Joan 2 screens where she once had 1. So what I am going to do today is really roar through as many slides as I possibly can to include as much discussion and to answer as many questions as we possibly can. So I'm going to speak for a few moments about sort of a historical overview and sort of why motivation and why now. What's the big deal with all of this? Talk a little bit about the importance of the responsivity principle, which basically holds that the only way for treatment to work is when we deliver our treatment in a way that our clients can respond to. And in the field of treating abuse and violence, one of my ways of thinking about this is to say we always need to have on our white lab coat. It's very easy for us in our work to form certain judgments, attitudes, or beliefs about our clientele or who knows, their family or whoever. And I heard a case example of this as recently as yesterday morning. I really want to work with this client. I just don't know how I can possibly get along with this person's family. And as a result, I've become a less effective therapist. A friend of mine here in the Portland, Maine area says, at least he likes to invite people to consider the idea that all judgment is a form of violence. And I'll let that sink in, and you can ponder that as something that may or may not be true for you. But what I do know is that when we do work in the field of abuse and trauma, it's very easy to form judgments. We really need to go in with the same attitude as a doctor. We put on our white lab coat and we go into work, and then all patients are equal. I'll talk a little bit about starting with strengths, give an overview of motivational interviewing, and as Joan said, try to include some take-home skills along the way. The way that webinars are structured these days, in order to get CE credits, you have to be able to answer all sorts of questions. So Naz and I worked long and hard to put together the questions for this webinar, which is why I'm going to go through some material rather quickly. If you get a chance, maybe even take notes, but the slides will be available to you. And I'm always available by email as well if you want. So I really want to make a couple of points clear from the outset, which is obviously I'm shooting to speak for about 30 minutes and answer questions. Nobody can become an expert from a webinar. I do hear people tell me who have been to some of my trainings that they've been practicing what I talked about a few weeks earlier, and they're now experts at it. And I don't know how they can say things like this, especially with skills such as motivational interviewing, which in my view can take many, many, many years to learn and to master. The content in this webinar is not basic. You may think I'm talking about basic skills, but that is actually not the case. What I've found from doing training on motivation and awakening motivation around the world is that most people can talk about these skills, but they can't actually demonstrate them in real life. And so I emphasize the foundation and add some take-home skills along the way. And again, I'm going to try to answer all the questions that I can and apologize if I can't respond to each one of them. We only have so much time together, and for some of us, this is the only opportunity that we get, whether we're from Maine or South Africa. So Here's the cover of our book. Joan already talked about it, so I won't say too much more about it, except that it was intended to be a self-guided workbook. This is supposed to be about people finding their own way into their own internal motivation. And after years of thinking that treatment was something that we should do to our clients or onto our clients, after years of thinking about models of treatment and techniques of treatment, I, like many others, have come to the conclusion that treatment should be something that we do with our clients and for our clients and on behalf of our clients, whether our client be the community or the client that's sitting in front of us, or perhaps their loved ones as well. I should give credit to Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick for making the point that treatment is something we do for and with clients and not to and on them. So I just have to also express some gratitude to my co-author, Robin Wilson. He and I have partnered up on many, many projects, and actually have a book on case studies that should be published hopefully in the next several weeks. Also, my colleagues Scott Miller and Daryl Chow, who've been doing some exemplary work studying clinicians and finding out what are the inherent qualities of clinicians that they can develop that contribute to success. The simple fact of the matter is that not all clinicians are equal in terms of their effectiveness, and these guys are producing some wild results on the qualities of truly excellent clinicians. And then finally, an old mentor of mine named Steve Berg-Smith, who taught me more than anybody about motivational interviewing itself. So these are just some of my colleagues, and I wanted to introduce them to you and speak really briefly about my own motivation for doing this. I found early on in my career that many professionals who I worked with seemed to be very interested in the most complicated aspects of providing treatment. They would talk at great length about all kinds of highfalutin clinical concepts and using a lot of sort of psychological gobbledygook language to talk about things that didn't seem to make a great deal of sense to me at street level. And I found that when we talked about things like therapeutic engagement and awakening internal motivation, that people tended to poo-poo it, to brush it off quite easily. And oftentimes we treat motivation as if it's something we identify in session one, and then we apply our fancy principles. As you can see, I've got some rather strong opinions about this. But I really do think that that it's something that we should pay attention to, especially in the area of treating abuse, where very often in the past we viewed treatment as more of a privilege than anything else. And I've heard therapists say treatment is a privilege, and if you behave badly in my treatment groups, I will throw you out. And of course, research has shown that that is a very poor strategy that can actually make things worse. I've always come at the work from the perspective that the ability of all human beings to change, even if they never get out of a confined facility, is a basic human right. All people should have the right to build a better life for themselves. And I've heard other people say things like, I only accept you if you accept my timetable for change. And frankly, there are some days I've gotten sick of programs that say, here is the evidence-based treatment curriculum that lasts 12 sessions, et cetera, et cetera. There is a time and a place for these kinds of treatment approaches, of course. But I'm really interested in how do we engage our clients. If we don't have engaged clients, we don't have treatment. And so part of my story goes back here to the women's rights movement in the 1960s. My mother was an English professor, and actually still is at the time. I like to joke that that's her over on the right-hand corner of this picture. But when I look at this picture, I'm reminded that across time and place and culture, people have gotten together to talk about the things that bother them, and that probably the greatest advances we've made as societies have been when people get together to say, this is simply no longer acceptable. And so a lot of the foundation for treating abuse and violence started here. And I think to some degree, I look at this picture and I keep coming back to what is it after all of our technological advances that makes it, let me say this differently. I continue to be amazed that if all of the things that research shows really works for people who are trying to bounce forward from traumatic events or trying to become less dangerous people, of all of the things that really seems to work, it's the most low-tech intervention of all, the human conversation. And the same thing has happened even in our field. This is a picture of the first ATSA conference. You can tell it's old because that's actually an overhead projector that is the predecessor to PowerPoint slides. Those of you under 50 might not have seen one before. That was a joke, by the way. And so over time, though, at this first ATSA conference and subsequently, we found out that people themselves have many motivations for the behaviors that they engage in. Some people abuse out of a strictly sexual motivation. Some people turn to sexual behavior as a means of meeting unmet needs or perceived needs in other areas of their life, etc. This fellow came along in 1974, and I mention him by name, Robert Martinson. Robert Magnus Martinson was his middle name. He published an article that became known as the Nothing Works Doctrine. And I believe that he's very important because he hit the lecture circuit prematurely, saying that he had analyzed prison-based rehabilitation programs and had concluded that no form of psychological treatment was reducing dangerousness, was reducing crime. And he was very quickly discredited, but his actions led to the complete defunding of many rehabilitative efforts around the U.S. I realize 1974 is quite a long time ago, 41 years. But as I typically say, I think the ghost of Robert Martinson is very often alive in our work. In the form of a kind of therapeutic nihilism or a belief that maybe a lot of our efforts are in vain. In fact, some of the first analyses, like Furby and her colleagues, found no overall differences in outcomes due to the methods used. But what they've subsequently found is that sex offenders who do successfully complete our treatment programs really do seem to reoffend at lower rates than those who don't. There's just been a new meta-analysis published by Schmucker and Luzel out of Europe. I'm hoping that we'll cover it in an upcoming edition of the NERI newsletter. But it turns out that the people who are completing our treatment programs really do reoffend at lower rates. And this is just important for us to take into account. And in fact, I'm going to go and take it a step further and say that your efforts, each one of you on this webinar, really, really matter. And I use as my evidence for this a fascinating study done by Bruce Wampold and Jeb Brown 10 years ago now. They looked at 581 therapists and over 6,000 real-world clients. And they basically looked at a number of diagnoses and asked the questions, so which therapists got the best outcomes and what qualities were there? And what they found was that training makes no difference. And I know this is a training, so please don't get on my case for this. But I think the take-home message of any training is this will be a nice memory in 2 weeks if you're not taking away something from it and deliberately applying it to your practice, seeking to be a better clinician. My guess is if you signed up for this particular training, you're already interested in being a better clinician. But very often that is not the case. They also found that what your profession is makes no difference. So if you're a social worker, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, there doesn't seem to be any difference in outcomes. Experience makes no difference. So for 31 years in this field, there's really no evidence unless I can provide it, which actually I can, that I'm a better than average therapist. So your experience doesn't necessarily make you a better therapist. Sometimes we just get old and jaded and cynical. And then finally, and very interestingly, diagnosis seems to make no difference in the quality of treatment outcomes either. What it ultimately boils down to for me is you should ask yourself, are you able to produce sex offenders or other kinds of clients who are stable, who are able to keep themselves occupied with a job or education? Are your clients accountable to supportive people? And for all we know, you might be the first supportive person in their entire life. And the safest clients have some sort of a plan for the future, and of course, everything to lose by repeating past behavior. This comes from my dear friend Gwen Willis and Doug Bauer, both in the sort of greater New Zealand and Australia area. And then finally, this slide, which I use just to highlight the fact that after many, many decades of study, all of our attempts to punish crime away don't seem to have worked. Tying all of the threads together, if you want to reduce the harm of trauma and of abuse, the ultimately most important thing that you have is yourself and your ability to engage with your client. If you don't have those two things, you're not going to have successful treatment. So let's talk quickly about some takeaway skills. I'm going to say from now on, you should be the person who is working hard to create new mindsets. Start every session with the attitude that, let me say it differently, get into the mindset of creating new mindsets. It's actually a direct quote from Jeff Zeig and one that I think is extremely important. That means that the minutes immediately preceding your group or individual therapy session are going to be amongst the most important that you have. Always go slow and listen long. Taking these from the work of NERI author Gerald Blanchard, as well as my close friend Joanne Schladel, who once observed that the slower you go, the faster you get where you're going. So our number one job is to listen, but not just to listen, to demonstrate that we're listening. You might even ask yourself, when's the last time that somebody really listened to you in a way where you truly knew that they got it? And as a good rule, you might even try spending the first 20% of every session simply engaging your client. I don't mean engaging in idle chit-chat. I mean making sure that your client is fully engaged in the process before you start working on your agenda or his or her agenda for the session. 20% of a session is a lot. That means if you only have 5 minutes, don't go anywhere until after 1 minute of pure and total engagement. And for an hour-long session, that means 12 minutes. You should always listen for ambivalence. Again, I'd invite you to consider doing your best to constantly listen to your clients in a way where you're doing your best to try to imagine what is any place in this client's life where they feel two ways about anything. If you develop that attitude, where is this client ambivalent? What's the difference between where this person is and where they want to be? If you can do your work in that sort of a way, you will always have something to talk about with your clients. Because when you're dealing with abuse and trauma, you're always dealing with somebody who is not in the place in their life where they want to be. Another principle for motivational interviewing is the idea of dancing with discord. We used to think in terms of client resistance. It's a term that goes all the way back to Freud. I really don't believe in the concept anymore. I think resistance is a concept that is just too big. And many of us in the MI, motivational interviewing community, have divided it into half, where part of what we used to think of as being resistance is the fact that you're just not getting along. You haven't made good inroads with your client yet. That's discord, as opposed to perhaps clients simply not being ready to change yet. Got a little bit more about that later on. And then, of course, all therapists should enter every session with the attitude that we need to expect and respect the unexpected. And ultimately, to whatever extent is possible, be multimodal. and use your space. Don't be like David Prescott back in 1984, who was all cognitive all the time. So to whatever extent possible, make sure that you're appealing to all five senses in your clientele, because after all, you are the most influential presence. You are much more influential than your model or the individual techniques that you use. And in fact, all of the research out there seems to suggest that there is more difference between individual therapists than there is between the various models and techniques that we use. We just don't talk about that very much. So another mindset, another sort of anchor point. My friend Steve Berg-Smith likes to say that before you go painting your home, you have to get rid of the old paint. So awakening motivation to change, we're talking about the prep step to change. This is the first step to change. And then later on, you might then start to think about putting that new coat of paint onto your home, and this is the rest of your treatment program. We talk a lot about things like CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy and other sorts of things, but all too often we forget about some of the micro skills that get involved in actually maintaining motivation. So the ultimate reality, especially in the field of abuse and trauma, is that we need to build willing partners in change. As a supervisor, 80 to 90% of the stuck cases that come across my desk have to do with there's a breakdown in the relationship that the clinician has with their client. There's a lack of agreement on the goals of treatment. There's a lack of agreement on the tasks of treatment. And very often there is fuzziness around, or a lack of agreement around, what is the role of the clinician in the client's life. In other words, what the client wants and what the clinician believes their role to be tend to be two very different things that clinicians don't tend to talk about very much. Based on the research that I've mentioned before, we also need to build treatment completers. We don't yet know what the X factor is in treatment. We do know that there are certain areas we need to work on in treatment, but there really isn't any research into sort of what's the, I'm trying to remember what they call the God particle, the Higgs boson particle. What is it that's really the active ingredient that makes your treatment work over and above your treatment goals and the specific tasks that you use? So above all, ask yourself, is your client able to respond to the work that you're doing with them? So we've talked a lot about resistance and difficult clients and that sort of thing. I like to say for the past 130 or 140 years, we've blamed the client for their resistance. I think it's only fair that for the next 130 to 140 years, we should blame ourselves and go and look in the mirror. So the responsivity principle basically holds that we need to attend to these sorts of things if we're going to make sure that we're tailoring our interventions effectively to the needs of our clients. Increasingly, I am all about individualizing treatment, and not just individualizing treatment in a way that makes our treatment plans look good to our licensing agencies and people who come in to inspect our records, but to make sure that our clients are signed on 100%. One of the problems with the responsivity, something really common to people who've been abused and who have abused, is that many of them come to us with relationship problems. We try to form relationships with them, and they have problems with the relationships themselves. And on the other hand, we can have our own problems with relationships ourselves. I'm fond of saying I'm not sure that the divorce rate of clinicians is much different from the divorce rate of the general public. So relationships can be a problem. All of our clients seem to come into treatment with some degree of learning difficulties. I consulted to a case yesterday in another part of the U.S. Where this 11-year-old had no background of learning disabilities or learning difficulties and was in fact a very good student. And I kept thinking to myself, this is really unusual. I'm so used to having something along these lines. Who knows? Perhaps they just haven't discovered it yet. I don't know. But it goes to show that if we adhere too strictly to an overly manualized approach, that we're not going to get our clients to learn how to lead different lives any better than we can get this young fellow here to learn how to use a computer keyboard. We could try rewarding him with extra treats. We could try threatening to take away his TV time or what have you. It's not going to work if our people can't learn from our interventions. Of course, many of our clients come in with backgrounds of hyperactivity. I'm sure that everybody on this webinar knows this as well as I do. Of course, many of our clients have problems with communication. And it always amazes me that we spend so much time on talk therapy when our clients barely know how to communicate. And sometimes, quite frankly, neither do we. And then there's within this the sort of paradoxical communication that can sometimes take place in our treatment programs as well. Robin Wilson and I wrote an article about this based on our experiences in the civil commitment of high-risk people who have sexually abused. Ask yourself, have you ever thought to yourself, you need to be more motivated to change? When in fact, motivation is something that can really only come from within. We talk about things like motivational interviewing as if we could possibly motivate another person. You might even say to yourself or ask yourself, have you ever heard somebody say, well, you know, nobody can make you change. Only you can make you change. We have a joke about how many psychologists it takes to change a light bulb, and the answer is only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. It's amazing to me how we seem to forget these things until we actually try to work with clients, and then all too often we seem to put the onus on ourselves for getting them to be more motivated to change. That's not how it works. We invite motivation to change. We awaken motivation to change, etc. We have other forms of paradoxical communication, the idea of the good lives model, holding the promise of a good life, which to many professionals sounds a little bit like false advertising. And I'm very sympathetic to that view, even though I've written a great deal on the good lives model itself. Sometimes our languaging gets in our way. Sometimes we think it's our job to point out our clients' thinking errors, but we don't like to be reminded when we're using thinking errors ourselves. And of course, we expect our clients to demonstrate meaningful behavioral change within a highly controlled environment. We forget that very often our clients have a difficult time grasping the sort of high-minded concepts that we try to throw at them. And of course, we ask our clients to participate fully in treatment regimens that as professionals we very often can't seem to agree on ourselves. To this day, the idea of does treatment work remains the subject of numerous scholarly journal articles. And then finally, we have the problem of cognitive rigidity. We forget that our clients have a difficult time changing the way they think. My guess is that out of the many hundreds of people on this webinar, many of you have already started to think about your work just a little bit differently. There might have been something that I said that kind of got into your mind, almost like a pebble in your shoe, and you're kind of thinking about it and percolating it. And our clients very often can't do that. They tend to get very fixed in the way that they think. I think very often that's a byproduct of the abusive backgrounds that they've often emerged out of. But it's something that we forget. We forget how difficult life can be for our clients. So examples of ambivalence that I tend to see happening with my caseloads tends to be something like this. The client saying to you, look, I really want to work with you on the one hand, but I don't want to give up who I am. This is a threat to my very identity. I want to change, but I'm concerned that if I do change, I might be disrespected. and I want to maintain some amount of respect. I don't want to be in a one-down position with you. I want to be in treatment, but I don't want to be subjugated. I want to look at myself, but I don't want to feel as though I'm somehow less of a man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the next time you're talking to somebody, anybody, me or your partner or whoever, see what kinds of ambivalence you can that you can detect. There's ambivalence all over the place. And the piece that I'll say about all too many of our clients is that all too often people who've been through the kinds of bad experiences that our clients have don't tend to be very curious as individuals. This is a strange phenomenon that I've often wondered about. I found that I need to be twice as curious about them on their behalf, because while I grew up in a rather privileged background, all things considered, at least compared to my clients, I had the luxury of being curious about my life, asking myself questions about what is my place in the universe, what's the meaning and purpose of my life. And our clients have rarely had the chance to do that because they've grown up scanning their environments, looking for evidence of threats and danger and harmful intention on the part of their teachers and their other kids, and very often their treatment providers and heavens knows who else. They haven't had the luxury of being curious about what's going on inside them. And so some of the key themes for us, for Robin, myself, and many others are, above everything else, take some time just to notice what's going on, maybe inside you, maybe in your immediate environment, and just see what happens next. And I guess I'm not just talking about being mindful, but rather investigating each experience and then practicing making choices based on what you notice. So just notice. You could spend some time doing this yourself, maybe even just pausing or moving your body and just noticing what happens when you move your body. And then practice making choices in how you move your body based on what you notice within each of these little micro experiences. Some of you may know that I'm kind of taking a backwards approach to defining yoga without the breath work. But I think very often we talk too much about changing people's thoughts and behaviors well before they're aware that they even have thoughts or behaviors, because our clients have spent so much time responding to the world. So very briefly, let me just say, the first thing we should do is start with strengths. Now, I'm quite certain that almost everybody on this webinar has been just like me. When I'm out in a public place, I've engaged in that most unique human behavior called people watching. And anybody that's ever engaged in people watching knows that not everything that we think or say is 100% positive. And in fact, sometimes we're at our most creative when we are engaging in catty commentary about others. And so it's much easier to notice the faults in others than their strengths. So next time you're in a crowded public place, an airport, a restaurant, a bus stop, or a professional conference, maybe take a look around and just notice the strengths that you can identify in people. I've got a bunch of slides here that I like to show people. I'll start with this woman. I found her picture on the internet, and I don't know anything about her except for she has a really nice confidence in her face, a real confident posture. One person I showed this to said she's not afraid to have a little gray hair, which as a gray-haired person I particularly like. But if she dyed her hair, you could just as easily say, hey, you take some pride in your appearance and make sure that you always are looking your best. She's dressed professionally, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have this fellow here. When I show this in prison environments, a lot of people immediately think negative thoughts about him. They assume the worst about him. It's always really a little bit sobering to me, frankly. On the other hand, you might say, here's a patient man. He has a kind of look of some wisdom around him. He's not afraid to be who he is. He has a very daring fashion sense. I wouldn't ever wear that hat myself, but I celebrate the fact that he's willing to do so, etc. I think he's engaged in face painting. Other people say whoever he is, it looks like at least he has a job because he seems to be wearing a name tag, etc., etc. This is a picture also that I found online when I just went looking for people going about their daily lives and was surprised to find many negative statements said. Again, particularly when I've been working with employees in prison environments. People think negative things about them. I think when I look at them, they're two young women out on their own, enjoying some connection with others. I see some independent spirit about them. Again, I couldn't wear those shoes myself, but I'm happy that they are happy enough to do so. It seems rather daring. So these young women seem to present with any number of strengths themselves, and if we can't identify the strengths in our clients, then who will? I guess that's really where I'm coming from. And you might only have a few seconds in your session to be able to actually identify some strengths in your clients, not just the little strengths like has good taste in music or good verbal skills, but what is it that makes this person tick that you can reflect back to them that signals a deep understanding of who they are? There's this fellow here who some people say looks brooding and thoughtful. You might say he has something on his mind, but maybe a more positive way of saying that is that he's pensive, he's thoughtful, he's thinking deep thoughts. Again, questionable footwear, but hey, what's not to like in this picture? And as one person someplace, somewhere said, the least you can say about him is that he seems to have very good shampoo. There's no limit to the amount of strengths that you could find when you take a few moments to look at your client. This woman, obviously working with a purposeful gaze, obviously has a very strong character, dressed all in red. Some people can relate to her because that seems to be a Neiman Marcus, a shopping bag that she has, so obviously she has good taste. I'm not sure I've ever stepped into one, but audiences seem to like this picture quite a bit. There's this woman who seems quite poised, creative, et cetera, et cetera. There's this man here who certainly looks as though he enjoys having a good time, has a little bit of creativity in the way that he's able to twist his balloons into knots. Some people say he seems obviously tipsy, but I always try to remind them we're simply looking for the strengths, and fun-lovingness can be a strength. If he's pursuing having fun by being drunk in a public place, why, then that's a conversation we can have with him later. Our job is to start with strengths. And that even goes when you're dealing with some of the most difficult people on the face of the earth. Yes, I realize this is a ridiculous assignment. Audiences tend to be able to say some good things about Adolf Hitler here, that he certainly was a charismatic leader, et cetera, et cetera. There's usually an objection that somebody's family history is such that they could never work with Hitler, even if he had survived and was now signing consent to your treatment program or what have you. And I always remind people that's why we have codes of ethics that we refer people out, et cetera, et cetera. This is really just an exercise. Can you affirm people or find something strength-based in a person like Muhammad Atta from the 9/11 hijackings, that he, for example, was passionate, had a firm commitment to his religious beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. I'll let you continue all of this on your own and just spend a few minutes really briefly defining motivational interviewing and describing it. Again, this is the kind of thing that takes people years to study, but I just want to give you a taste of it. If you've already been to a motivational interviewing training, I hope you will go to more. If you are new to motivational interviewing, I hope these final few minutes inspire you to go and get some training at the introductory level. Basically, MI, it's a person-centered counseling style for addressing ambivalence about change. Just really briefly, take a look at this. We think a lot of times about treatment. We think a lot of times about treatment programs, and as I said earlier, models and techniques. Maybe we should start thinking about how people change. How can we get this person to a different place in his life? And motivational interviewing starts with a fundamental spirit or a mindset of partnership and acceptance and compassion and evocation. Now, you might notice that partnership, acceptance, and compassion are central to all successful forms of therapy, and they're central to all forms of bona fide or at least realistic religions around the world. What's new in this picture is this idea of evocation. Again, our job is to be curious on behalf of our clients. Motivational interviewing, starting with engaging, followed by focusing on what is it that's meaningful for the client to change. And it might also be something that you know from a risk assessment or a treatment plan or what have you. You then evoke why would this person want to make a change in this area, and how would they go about making a change in this area if indeed they wanted to do so. And after exploring this for a while, you can then get into some degree of planning. I mention all of this because these processes tend to be linear. We always start with engagement, but they can also be recursive. For example, if you are getting too far into the planning stage or into the planning process too early in the game, you might need to go back and re-engage your client. Again, entire book chapters written about this. And then we think in terms of there's many different ways of talking to somebody. Sometimes our clients come and say that they're not interested in making a change. They want to sustain how things are going for them. Or they might make some indication that they're willing to make a change in an area, or they signal some kind of deep commitment to change. But in this way of working, there really is no such thing as resistance. Instead, there's really only people who are not interested in making a change. And as I said earlier, this is when we come in to try to awaken their internal motivation to change.
Hey, David, I'm going to just do a time check with you.
Yep, I'm almost done.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So, yes, I've got my trusty dusty watch as well. I'll just say really quickly, change talk is what we're listening for. Desire, ability, reason, or need to change. I want to change. I can change. There's good reason to change, or I need to change. And when we hear this, our job is basically to say, tell me more, to provide some sort of affirmation or reflect back what we hear, or offer some kind of summarizing statements. There's basically 4 skills, which I don't have that much time to get into. Open-ended questions, which I'm sure you've heard before, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. I think in the interest of time, I am going to leave this slide up. You've got my contact information. I'm going to talk very briefly about reflective listening and just say, the next time you're listening to somebody talk, take the Prescott challenge, and as you're listening to them, simply repeat back in your mind some of the words that you hear them say, and then reflect back in your mind some of the emotions that you're hearing as they say these things, and then reflect back some of the meaning underneath what you're hearing them say. A good reflective statement is always something more than what the client has said, but never more than they actually mean. This is very different from an interpretation, but rather our job is to think of ourselves in terms of being a mirror, sort of reflecting back to the person what we hear them say. So at this point, I'm going to get Joan involved and just ask, Joan, what kinds of questions are we seeing? I know we're short on time, unfortunately, but I needed to cover all 10 of the post-test questions.
Absolutely. I appreciate this. I find this all, I could hear you talk about motivational interviewing for hours. So I think just one thing I wanted to do, just to remind people, if you do have some questions, to please write them in the question area, and we can get to them. And if we can't get them during the webinar, we can certainly get back to you at a later point. Also, just Greg, I just would be helpful. Could you just do the poll very quickly? Because I know I forgot to do that initially. And just want to run that poll. So we want to get a sense of just how many people have actually attended a NERI webinar before. And it would be great for us to just get a sense of that as we think of doing our own outreach. So on your screen, you should be able to see the poll. Is that right, Greg? And yes. And so if you could go ahead and answer that. And also just really appreciate how many people have stayed on the webinar the whole time. And just some of the questions, and maybe just even that we're getting in. So it'd be just, so it's just, I guess you're hearing it's under getting some sound quality. So thank you for that feedback as well. We really appreciate any and all feedback here. So if you can give us the results of the poll, Greg.
Okay. Very good. I call these recidivists. Very nice. Welcome back, and welcome to the newer folks. That's marvelous.
Great. So thank you. So just in terms of some of the questions, David, that one of the first questions we got through here is that just really understand that the clients are going back into the world, and they want to have a chance to keep the client occupied so early in the process, and sometimes it seems difficult when employment is such a big issue and it's such a significant barrier. So how can you keep the clients motivated while also helping them stay busy and engage in that employment process, looking for employment?
Oh, sure. Ask the $64,000 question up front and sort of stump the chump question. I think what that is the kind of case management and therapeutic challenge that we all face every day. I will say, I'm hearing a noise, but I don't think we're in danger. Okay. I will say there's a civil commitment program, and I'll even say they're in New Jersey. The New Jersey Civil Commitment Program has developed an excellent method for doing this to the best of their abilities, where nobody wants to hire a a sex offender who's just come out of a civil commitment program. And one of the things they do where you can't keep the person occupied, you can at least keep them connected to the greatest extent possible. And so New Jersey Civil Commitment Program did something called the Keep Safe program, which is where their clients who are placed out in the community actually will call into their old treatment groups or have some sort of structured phone contact with their old colleagues in their treatment groups. And I think that is a very clever idea. The simple fact, how do we keep our clients motivated? I think we need to take a really, really decent inventory in treatment, and we need to prepare our clients that it really is a jungle out there. For people getting out into the community, the world can be a pretty toxic place, and there's just no two ways around it, no any one way around it.
Thank you. That's helpful. And that was the Air Force Base near us doing a visit. So, also another great question was that when can you elaborate just more on what should be happening when you're spending sort of that 20% sort of engaging the client, and how do you know that that's not just sort of chit chat, but really is that there's a time and a place for it? How do you bring
Sure.
that?
Try to do this with an illustration. So here I am, I'm myself, and I'm really genuinely interested in talking with my client, who's right here in front of me, and at the front of my brain, I'm thinking, welcome back. You are always okay when you're in my office, and you always have options on what you need to talk about when you're with me. These things are always good. Now, there is a part of me that's way back over here that's also thinking, here's what's in my treatment plan. Here is what's in my assessment. And I might just say, tell me about your week. Catch me up on things. How are things going? And part of me is saying, right, check. I've got interpersonal relationships. That's in the treatment plan. That is a dynamic risk factor that he's working on. I'm listening for that sort of thing. I'm listening for his overall stability. I'm listening for any signs of impulsivity. I'm listening for what kinds of things will I want to work on later on, but that I'm just purely listening with interest to him right now. So I got a little bit working back here, but mostly I'm there for my client. I believe that answered the question, but contact me off the webinar if it didn't. Oh, Joan, I think you're.
Yeah, great. I'm sorry. Thank you for that reminder. It's summertime in Holyoke, so there's a lot of noises happening. I keep trying to cut out here. So thank you for that reminder. So if you could just maybe talk a little about some of the techniques that that you might be able to keep the motivational interview skills, refreshed and also and fresh, and also particularly how you do that in reviewing by and working with peers.
Yeah. Ooh, excellent.
Yeah.
Let me answer the second question first. When you're working with your peers, constantly try to work with them around reflective listening. Practice. Go and don't be afraid to be embarrassed, just to practice with your peers. One agency that I worked with did a motivational interviewing tip of the week where they said, one person said, here's how I used motivational interviewing this week, or here's how I kept a client engaged against all odds, and that's what I've got to say for this week. Tag Joan Tabachnik, you're it for next week. It's your turn next week to talk about how you kept a client engaged. There's any number of ways to do these kinds of things. The next one is we spend way too much time as therapists thinking about what can I do when I'm in my session in order to be a better therapist. I'll invite you to focus on the stuff that happens outside of your sessions and try doing some self-improvement exercises. For example, noticing every time you get just a little bit judgmental towards anybody, anywhere, anytime. It could be listening to NPR, National Public Radio. It could be talking to your partner or your kids. Notice anytime you're judgmental about anything and practice keeping your judgment in check. Before you do a session, practice lowering your shoulders, slowing your breathing, not paying attention to the walls around you or your task list, and simply focus on who your client is and how you hope to help them during that day. I've, like Scott Miller and many others, I've come to believe that what we do outside of sessions is actually more important than what we do in them in terms of the preparatory work for how do we deal with accepting human beings who have engaged in completely unacceptable behavior.
Yeah. And it seems like that's actually good advice for life in general. Listening to you, we only have if you can do this maybe in 1 minute. I think it's related to this previous question, but someone was saying that they only see their clients in the prison system every other week. And could some of the things you just suggested also help the clients in terms of how do you maintain the motivational interviewing techniques over that 2-week period when you're not actually having regular contact with your clients?
For maintaining the techniques as a clinician, yeah, I think everything that I just said. And then when you're going in there, I think the number one thing is stick with the style, stick with motivational interviewing, stick with doing this work, and your clients are going to really look forward to seeing you. And that our empathic and our attuned interventions are always a bit of a surprise to clients in the prison system. They're always welcome. They're always impactful. And they always will keep your client engaged, even if it's only every 2 weeks, which I agree is just not enough time. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's some other great questions here, which I'll make sure we get them over to you. And people, as David said earlier, feel free to contact him directly. I want to just take the last 2 minutes to, one, just remind people that we do have a newsletter, the Neary Press newsletter, that really that I love doing because it gives us a chance to take a research article each month and then digest it. And our idea is that it should be short enough and easy enough to read over a cup of coffee. So please, if you do get that, tell your friends about it. And if you're on this webinar, we'll automatically sign you up for that. So you'll be getting one next month. To let people know that the next webinar is by Cordelia Anderson, and she will be talking about the impact of pornography on children, youth, and culture. And this is actually part 2, so you can listen to part 1, which was aired last year, and it'll be on the website, and there'll be a link on that as well. And I just want to also say a big, huge thank you to our sponsors. And we could not be doing this without sponsors. And the sponsors include the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the Crime Prevention Branch, which is from Canada. Thank you, our Canadian neighbors. Family-led Counseling and Psychiatric Services, Jarena and Associates, Leo A. Hoffman Center, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, the Morrison Children and Family Services, New Hope Treatment Center, St. Mary's Home for Children, Euro Counseling, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And I'll just say that anyone can become a sponsor. For individuals, it's $98, and for organizations, it's $250. You're guaranteed a seat on every webinar. So in our sold-out ones, you're guaranteed. You have access to CE credits, and you also get two free Neri Press books. So it's actually a win-win situation, I think, for all of us. Mostly, I want to just say thank you, David. Really, I love doing these with you, and they're so informative. If you look at for the audience, thank you for joining us. And again, you can listen to this on a recording. The PowerPoint presentation is on our website, and this has been a great, really helpful webinar. I'm definitely going to be paying attention to this when I get home tonight.
Thanks for letting me share my passion.
All right, take care. All right, thanks.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.